Hello everyone, good evening. I'd like everyone to take their seats. You already have, so that's good. I'd like to welcome you here tonight. My name is Isela Guzman, and I am the events coordinator for Asociación de Latinoamericanos. We are all here tonight to discuss the book, Our History is Still Being Written. And tonight we have with us our featured speaker, who is Mary Alice Waters. We will have a panel discussion. Each of our panelists will talk a few minutes about an aspect of the book they found interesting, and then our featured speaker will talk last. Afterwards, we will have a question or comment section. So if you do have any questions or comments, please hold them off until the end. Tonight, I am co-chairing with Christopher Hudson from Manners. So, this meeting started when we invited Mary Alice Waters to come and speak here with us. And then when she accepted, we started working with other groups, collaborating with them, building up this meeting, and getting sponsors so that you all could be here. So I'm very thankful to everyone who helped us sponsor. Let's remember that we are here to listen to a point of view. The sponsors don't necessarily agree or disagree with what we are presenting here today. So, let's start. We're going to start the meeting with Christopher's going to say a few words.
All right, well, good evening. As Isela said, my name is Christopher Hudson. I am president of the Manners organization here at Iowa State, Manners being Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. I know it's a mouthful. I guess to show how Manners got involved with this, I was talking to Frank Forster at the Club Fest, and he began talking to me and another Manners member about Mary Alice Waters' book, and it seemed really interesting, so we haven't brought a speaker in, and we figured that this would be one of the best speakers to bring in this semester, as it was a very moving subject. So I guess just getting straight into it, first up would be, also I want to thank David Acker, the Assistant Dean of the College of Agriculture. He was a major help fund-wise, so I just wanted to recognize him before we get on with this. Okay, first up would be Juan Luis Vivero, graduate student. He's the auditor of the Asociación de Latinoamericanos. So just want to introduce him.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, firstly, I would like to thank Mary Alice, and the people from Pathfinder, the university, and the student associations to give us the opportunity to read and talk about this interesting book. So they asked me to give some comments about the book. Overall, well, I can say that I like the book. It's very interesting, the book. It's easy to read, and it has a lot of supporting information in the back of the book, where in the appendix or in the glossary, well, you have a lot of data that you can check in the way that you are reading the book. I would like to focus in two parts of the book. In the part 2, that is called Strengthening the Revolution. In the part 3, that is called Special Period and Beyond. In the case of the part 2, the three generals made a vivid description of the participation of Cuba in the fight for Angola's independence. Besides, Cuba's volunteers stayed in that country for 15 years. In response to a request from the government of Angola to defend Angola from the threat of Zaire, South Africa, and rebel groups. Before before to read the movie, I didn't know the important role that this internationalist mission of Cuba in Angola and other countries of Africa had over this continent. Further, seems to be that these missions were an important factor to the end of the apartheid in South Africa. So that point catch my attention. I didn't know that the importance of Cuba to go to this continent and help the people to develop their own independence. At the moment that I finished that part, a crazy connection came to my mind. So I was saying Cuba helping Angola through Chinese Cuban people. So the connection was, okay, we have Cuba, Latin America. We have Angola, Africa. We have Chinese Cuban people, meaning we have Asia involved. So these three parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, are that we call the third world. So I say, why instead of this talk we refer to the help of Cuba to Angola through these Chinese Cuban generals? Why don't we think in Latin America helping Africa through Asia or vice versa? So that's what my crazy thought. Why don't put all the third world together and help each other? So in the case of the part 3, that, as I say, is related to the special period. The special period is the crisis that Cuba struggled after the end of the Soviet Union. So after the end of the Soviet Union, all that was imported from the Soviet Union to Cuba, all the sugar that go from Cuba to Soviet Union was stopped, was ended. So they were struggling a huge crisis of food, oil, and economic crisis in general. In this part, what really caught my attention is that the question that the generals are answering are related with issues that Cuba is facing today. It's not something that was in the past. Most of the literature that I have read about Cuba was about Cuban Revolution, about Che Guevara, about Fidel Castro, all this kind of stuff. But in this book, I found something that is happening in Cuba today. As I say, they're struggling with the dealing with the energy, food, and economic crisis. I would like to emphasize in this part the strategy that Cubans follow to battle the food crisis. They develop and improve the urban agriculture, something like they call organoponics. Well, I don't know too much about agriculture. Maybe people from the agronomy department can go more in deep in this side, in this issue, this organoponic issue. But what I think is this is a very clever idea of finish this crisis, this food crisis. Meaning that through all these organoponics that they developed in Cuba, they were able to supply all the food that they were importing from the rest of the world. So I don't see the reason why it cannot be applied in other countries. Actually, in the book, the general, one of the generals in the book, his name is Moises C.O. Wong, mentioned that this strategy is being applied right now in Venezuela. But one of the things that caught my attention was that he also mentioned that this kind of agriculture system only can work in revolutionary countries. As I say, I'm not an expert in this topic, so I was wondering why just in revolutionary countries. I don't have the answer. Other topic that was interesting for me was the one related with internationalist mission of Cuba. Actually, most of the book is related with volunteers that go from Cuba, as I said before, to Africa, to Central America, to South America, and to another countries to help for crisis, earthquakes, or all these kind of things. And I focus in this topic because it answered one of the questions that I always have had about Cuba. And the question is, if Fidel Castro is a dictator and he doesn't have the support of the wealthy people of Cuba and the world, how come has been able to be in Cuba as leader for 50 years? That's one my question. So reading through this book, I found maybe the answer, which the generals mentioned. They mention that in the section that is called The Battle of the Ideas. They say when they take younger Cubans to other countries, they realize the economic system in that countries. Like, let's say, for example, if they go to Venezuela, they realize that the people is very poor in that country. And there are another very rich people, a few rich people. So they realize of these differences in other countries. So I was wondering if maybe that's the reason why Fidel Castro has been in Cuba for so long time, because the people say, okay, maybe I'm in bad conditions, but maybe my conditions are not as bad as this country in Africa, or Central America, or South America. And finally, I would like to thank you for listening to me. And I would like to ask Maria-Alice a question that is not related with the book, but I need to ask that question. And the question is, now that Fidel Castro has resigned as president of Cuba, in Maria-Alice's opinion, what is going on for Cuba now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Luis. Next, we would like to invite Professor Max Shelley. Professor Max Shelley is a professor of political science and statistics here at Iowa State University. So please welcome him.
Gisela, thank you very much. Well, this year celebrates the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Quito Cavanale, which occurred in Angola, and it involved major engagements, military set-piece battles between South African military forces. This is at a time when South Africa was still ruled by the apartheid regime. On the one side of the conflict. The other side, you had a mixture of Angolan and Cuban troops. As Gisela pointed out, I happen to be both in the political science department and the Department of Statistics. So the politics of this and the sort of flow of this battle got my attention. I happen to come from a military family, and so that was interest naturally there as well. And there were some interesting numbers that came into play here that I thought were particularly enlightening. Well, just a little bit of brief background on this. The country of Angola was scheduled to become officially independent from Portugal, which was its colonial master, up until late 1975. November 11th, 75 was the official date of independence. And a bit before that, there was foreign intervention actually from two sides. Angola was essentially being invaded both from north and south. There were troops coming in from Zaire, now Congo, and in particular they were interested in seizing oil fields in Cabinda, which is in the far northwest corner of the country. So there's certainly economic interest there as well, as this interest in trying to make sure that this new government didn't come into power. Somewhat more importantly, were also military incursions from the south. Through Namibia, South African troops were entering Angola as well. In fact, there were a couple of different invasions by armed forces from the South African apartheid government. Well, what got my attention in particular about this context is that in the course of about 16 years, from November 1975, right when this crisis first began, through May of 1991, something like 375,000 Cubans volunteered to help beat off the South African assault, as well as the assault from Zaire. Now, Cuba's a country of about 11 million people, so 375,000 is a huge commitment. We're talking something, if you multiply by a factor of 20 or 25, you kind of get the equivalent person power contribution the United States would make in similar circumstances. So we'd be talking something probably along the lines of the number of Americans who served in Vietnam during the span of a long war there. So just think of this as a very intense commitment from a very small, poor country. Now, that's impressive enough by itself, but they won, which is at least as important as just the size of the intensity of the commitment. Well, as this war progressed, about a dozen years on into the South African and Zairean incursions, by late 1987, a decisive battle began to swirl around in the southern, probably the southeastern part of Angola. Significant South African military forces were making a major incursion through Namibia, and they occupied large parts of the southern tier of Angola. And they managed to surround Cuban and Angolan troops in the town of Quito Canavale. It's in far southeast Angola. And the Cubans and Angolans who were supporting the government that was by then in power beat off those assaults, and reinforcements eventually were brought in to kind of break the siege. And there was a flanking movement by Angolan and Cuban troops kind of going around the South Africans' flank and pulling an end run, and eventually encircled the South African forces and forced them to retreat. So the South African military forces retreated, and remember at this time South Africa was still ruled by the apartheid regime. They decided that they'd had enough by the end of the 1980s and figured it was time to sue for peace. And so basically, the South African apartheid regime gave up the fight. The Cubans won, the Angolans won, and Angola was able to achieve independence as a consequence. By December 1988, there was an official agreement signed at the United Nations by Cuba, Angola, and South Africa to end hostilities officially. But it had been decided on the battlefield, and South Africa really had to throw in the towel. So they agreed to remove their troops from Angola and to grant independence to Namibia. So actually two things happened at once. The military assault had been defeated from South Africa, and so Angola was effectively free from South African intervention in the future. And as a bonus, Namibia became an independent country as well. So a very nice two-for-one deal. Now, the Cuban troops stayed a little longer after those successes, but they left by May of 1991. And when they returned to Cuba, they were met, of course, by Fidel Castro and a very large number of very happy Cubans because of the success. What I want to draw attention to are some comments that were made by Nelson Mandela right at the time of these troops coming back victoriously in 1991. The speech that I'm going to quote just a little bit from was given in July of 1991. If you remember, this is about the time that Mandela had been released from prison and was on the verge of, I can't remember if he officially was president at that point, but was on the verge of becoming president of South Africa after it had been freed of the apartheid rule. Mandela visited Havana at the time these troops were coming back and made a number of very important comments that I think, to me at least, put this in context of the success of Cuba and the role that Cuba played in liberating Angola and Namibia, but even more than that, including South Africa itself. Here's a little bit of what Mandela had to say. Your presence, that means the Cuban troops, and the reinforcement of your forces in the Battle of Quito Canavale was of truly historic significance. The crushing defeat of the racist army at Quito Canavale was a victory for the whole of Africa. The overwhelming defeat of the racist army provided the possibility for Angola to enjoy peace and consolidate its own sovereignty. The defeat of the racist army allowed the struggling people of Namibia to finally win their independence. The decisive defeat of the apartheid aggressors broke the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressors. The defeat of the apartheid army was an inspiration to the struggling people inside South Africa. Without the defeat of Peter Kanavale, our organizations would not have been unbanned. So that, in other words, that means he was released from prison and progressive South African political forces were able to gain power. The defeat of the racist army at Peter Kanavale has made it possible for me to be here today. That's Mandela being in Havana, helping to review the troops as they return victoriously. Peter Kanavale was a milestone in the history of the struggle for Southern African liberation, and it has been a turning point in the struggle to free the continent and our country from the scourge of apartheid. Well, so what this drives home to me is just the transcontinental impact of a very small country, again, about 11 million people, making a huge person power contribution to this war, as well as a major contribution of national budget and other resources. And so the message, the takeaway message here, I think, is that small, impoverished countries certainly can beat imperialist aggressors. It takes some monumental effort, but it can happen and did happen in this case. And as a direct consequence of the Cuban involvement, a very large chunk of Africa was freed from racist rule. Many of those holdovers from the colonial days of the 19th and early 20th centuries. What I've been discussing, by the way, is in part 2 of the book. Our history is still being written, and I would definitely commend it for you to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Machelli. Now, please help me in welcoming Aaron Blake. He's a sophomore student and a member of the ISU Socialist Club. So.
Thank you. As she said, my name is Aaron Blake, and I am co-chairman of the Socialist Group here at ISU. I just want to say a few words about youth tonight. And myself working 2 jobs and going to school for full time, I know what it's like to have to struggle to get through school. And with the loans and interest rates like they are today, it's very difficult for students to get a good education, or rather, to pay for that good education. Education is vital to the struggle for freedom and independence in every aspect of our lives. Without education, where would we be? We'd be nowhere. I think we have an excellent institution here at Iowa State, but I also think that money has no place in education. If you could go to any college you wanted to, regardless of money restrictions, and you could do anything that you wanted to do, study any part of study you'd like to, what would be the limits on that? There is no limits. Money is the main limit on your course of study. We go through 4 years of institution, and we are promised a high-paying job. I don't know how many of you are students out there, but raise your hand if you believe you're getting a job right out of college. Probably a third of you, realistically, will be getting those jobs. The job market right now, let's face it, it's not doing so swell. And we're outsourcing jobs faster than we're bringing new jobs into the market. Not to mention the inflation that we're experiencing with our dollar, and rising gas prices, and the growing ethanol problem. Ethanol is a good thing for our states, at least farmers anyway, because it drives up the cost of corn, of course. But when you drive up the cost of corn, you also drive up the cost of food, period. because basically every single kind of food stems from the crops that we grow here in Iowa. That's why the economic crisis affects us the hardest right here in the heartland of the United States. Adding to this problem is we've been lucky here in Iowa. We have had a raise in the minimum wage. But nationally, the national minimum wage has not risen very much in the last 30 years. Whereas, if you look in the raise the CEOs have experienced, of the head of the companies, they have gotten a very large increase in their payment, to say the least. Skilled jobs are disappearing in this country, and what are we doing about it? The inherent part of capitalism that makes this possible is they automatically send jobs to be paid the lowest that they possibly can. This is crippling our nation. We find that the youth is kind of disenfranchised with politics these days. I'm happy to see a lot of young faces out there today. That it does me good to see that some people are interested in politics. They feel that they don't make a difference. What this book here proves is that youth does make a difference. When you look at how old some of the people were here, the three generals, when they started their revolutionary activities, they were our age or younger. So not only can you do something, but it's proven that people can do something, even if they're young. Today we get kind of busy with all the trends and the material goods that we say, like a new phone or a new iPod. And all these things are really distracting us from the central issue, which is actually politics. If you are interested in politics, you're not interested in your own life. Having phones and all that technology stuff is good, but politics is vital to your life. I mean, vital to every aspect of your life. Some people feel that they have nothing to fight for. Well, here's something to fight for. Fight for yourself. Fight for your own rights. Fight for your own freedoms. And that pretty much concludes all that I have. So.
All right, now we'll have Keith King. He is the graduate vice president of the Manners Organization. So we'll have him come and speak about his outtake on the book.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. As said, my name is Keith King. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Agronomy here at Iowa State. It's funny, Aaron started out with youth because my area is going to be part one, the Cuban Revolution, the three revolutionaries. And dealing with youth, a lot of things that you experience as a youth is what it shapes you and molds you for what your passion is and your life passion is. So I'm going to give a biographical sketch of each one of the generals and what shaped them and how they came to be a part of the movement. And like we said, the three people we're talking about this evening is Armando Choi Rodriguez, Gustavo Chi Beltran, and Moises C.O. Wong. We'll start with Armando Choi. He was born in 1934 in Fomento, Las Villas province. From there, at the age of 14, he moved to Santa Clara with his family at age 14. He was also one of the founding members of the July 26 movement in 1955. And he joined the anti-Batista movement, or anti-Batista organization, Joven Patria, which was Young Homeland. And for people who aren't in the know with Batista, he was the leader of Cuba pre-Fidel Castro. And for me, the significance of that was I didn't know that Batista was actually backed by the United States. So for me, sometimes when we hear history, you only get one side. You really don't know what happened or what shaped why people did what they did. And a lot of times, even though I think it's generally understood that people paint Fidel Castro to be a bad person. But part of that may be the fact that he stood up what he thought was right for his country, and it just so happened the person that he was opposing was backed by the United States. But moving on, the three things that stood out to me that shaped him, Armando Troy, he showed compassion at a young age. All three of these men's fathers in some form of fashion were merchants. And a story that stood out for me was a gentleman came into their store while he was 14, and the gentleman was crying. And he said he didn't have anything to eat for the day. And he asked would they give him a pound of cornmeal to get them to eat for the day. And at the time, you could have got a pound of cornmeal for like 7 cents. And he agreed to give the man this pound of cornmeal for credit. And upon doing that, his father was upset with him. But at the time, he recognized that there was a need for a fellow man to be fed that obviously could not afford to feed his family. Also, he experienced racial discrimination at a young age. Him and a Chinese friend were rejected at a whites-only party, and this was a dance party in the neighborhood of Cuba. And at that point, he recognized the injustice at the time that prevailed in Cuba before the revolution, and that was part of the things that shaped him and motivated him to join the revolution. He joined the revolutionary struggle as a student in Santa Clara of March 10th of 1952, and this was the same day of the coup of Dictador of Batista. And early on, he says that he claimed to be a Fidelista. This was in July 26, 1953. And at the time, he thought Fidel was the right person to fight this fight. So we'll go on to Gustavo Chi Beltran. He was also a general. He was born in 1938 in Santiago de Cuba, and he lived in Los Olmos neighborhood. He joined the revolutionary movement at age 16. Excuse me. Other things that stood out, he was probably one of the more active members in the movement, moving up ranks rather quickly. Early in his life, like I said, his father also was a merchant. His mother was a poor black Cuban woman, and she had her parental rights taken away from her because at the time, his father's rich friends didn't agree with him being with a poor black Cuban woman. So her parental rights were stripped from her, and at the same time, they actually went back and changed his birth certificate. That way, she could not have any parental rights. As a child, he was laughed at by Cuban kids because he didn't speak Spanish. But over time, he learned to speak Spanish, eventually forgetting Chinese. The thing that shaped him to get involved in the movement, his father, as well as his rich Chinese parents, they lived comfortably. So as a result, he didn't experience a lot of the hardships that he saw fellow Cubans seeing during that time. And what made his father and his Cuban friends prominent, they were able to buy and sell bakeries pretty much on a whim and as they chose. And as a result of him seeing this, he sensed the social and political atmosphere around him and at various neighborhoods he lived in. So he joined the July 26 movement at the beginning of 1957. And this was, at the time he joined, he was underneath the eventual rebel army captain. And then we have Moises C.O. Wong. He was born in 1938 in the Matanzas province, and he moved with his family to Havana, Cuba in 1947. He joined the fight against Batista as a high school student, and he participated in demonstrations and other protest actions. And he became a member of the July 26 movement after its founding in 1955, and he led the first youth brigade of Havana at age 17. In 1957, he joined the rebel army Sierra Maestra, serving in command post platoon led by Fidel Castro. Like I said, his father came to Cuba in 1895 with his first wife. His father also owned a grocery store. and at the time his father had 4 children. Upon remarrying, his father had 11 more children. For him and his family, the key thing, his sister married a rich man, and the rich gentleman took advantage of him and his siblings, having them work in his restaurant for pennies on the dollar, and he would fix the books where it looked like they were getting paid at the time 60 cents an hour, where the oldest may have only gotten 45 cents and the younger ones wouldn't get paid anything. And only thing that he would do is maybe on Sundays is give them enough money to go to the movies. He also joined the July 6th movement after attack on Mikado. And the other things that stood out, well, it was more of a funny story. Part of the movement, and as he was moving up in ranks, he was in hideout for a few weeks because the Batista army was looking for him. So he finally had a guy write him a letter to go up to Sierra Maestra where Fidel Castro was. And he got the letter, met up with Fidel, but on the way up there he ran into a few other gentlemen that were heading the same way. Well, they got there, met with Fidel, and Fidel read the letter and told them, put them in the barracks and don't feed them anything but rice. And he had heard about Fidel, and he thought he was going to be accepted with open arms. Well, what come to find out, Fidel came back the next day and apologized to him, and the guy who wrote the letter for him had obeyed a direct order of not to send anybody up to them without having weapons, guns, and clothes. So, but after the fact, and after he apologized, he served underneath Fidel, as well as 3 other generals, or the other 2 generals of Che Guevara and Raul Castro, which he served under him for 7 years. And that concludes my section of just giving you a biographical sketch of what shaped them to become 3 revolutionaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. Now we are going to hear from Mary Alice Waters. Here's just a few facts about her. Mary Alice is president of Pathfinder Press. She has edited more than a dozen books of interviews, writings, and speeches of leaders of the Cuban Revolution. In the past month, Mary Alice has spoken to hundreds of students and others in Miami, the University of Rutgers in New Jersey, the University of Northern Texas, and most recently at Seattle University in Washington. Please come on. Thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. To have the opportunity to have this kind of meeting and discussion built around this book around the Cuban Revolution. And I want to say right at the beginning 2 things. One is that the 3 authors of this book, who you've just been introduced to by Keith, asked me to bring their greetings to this meeting as well. I had the opportunity to be with them and talk with them in Havana a few weeks ago, and to tell them about the meetings coming up that Isla just referred to, and their very great interest in these meetings, and the interest in this book, and why, and the kind of response. And especially when I told them that one of the focuses of this meeting here in Iowa, at the Iowa State tonight, would be the question of agriculture in Cuba and environmental policies of the Cuban Revolution, they were even more pleased to learn about that. The second thing I want to say is that I hope that many of you will have many questions, including on what we're talking about tonight, and some of the things we may not all get to, such as the question that Juan Luis posed earlier, and that we'll be able to come back to questions during the discussion period that many of you may have. because I want to concentrate on two things. A little bit about where this book came from and how it came about, but why it's important for us here in the United States, why the example of the Cuban Revolution is important for us here in the United States. Many people have asked me, they expressed some curiosity as to a book about 3 Chinese Cubans who were generals of the Revolutionary Armed Forces. Where did this come from, and how did you get into this? And really, what does it have to do with agriculture? all questions which have been posed, and the answer is a short version. This is not the first book that Pathfinder has published about the Cuban Revolution, or that I've been involved in working on and editing either. And several of the others have been similar in one respect. That is, several of them have been interviews with men and women like Armando Choi, Gustavo Chui, and Moises Siu Wong. Men and women who today are shouldering very central responsibilities as leaders of the Cuban Revolution, whether it's in the field of government, culture, trade unions, women's organizations, the armed forces, or whatever. But all of them were part of that generation that were young people almost 50 years ago when the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista came to power in Cuba through a military coup that others have already referred to, backed by the United States government, and what was up to that time one of the most brutal dictatorships ever in the history of Latin America was established. And the men and women like our 3 generals that we're talking about tonight, as most of them as teenagers in Cuba, were confronted with what was the biggest decision of their lives: how to respond to those conditions and that reality, whether to go down on your knees in the face of that kind of repression and social injustice, or to start to fight. And they chose the path of fighting. They refused to accept the indignities and the brutalities of life under a military dictatorship in Cuba. And they joined the revolutionary underground in the cities to begin with. When the revolutionary activities in the cities became too dangerous, they were, as Keith described, they were being sought by the police. They joined the Revolutionary Army that was fighting in the Sierra Maestra Mountains and the Escambray Mountains of Cuba. And in a period of roughly 6 years of revolutionary struggle, the people of Cuba, in their growing thousands and thousands, succeeded in overthrowing the dictatorship of Batista. I should say that it's important to understand that this was not, we're talking about Cuba here tonight, but it's always important to put Cuba in the world. This wasn't an isolated event in the world. I think that the Cuban Revolution was in many ways the most advanced point of the great wave of national liberation struggles that swept Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Caribbean, beginning in the years of World War II and in the following. And when that revolution triumphed in 1959, the men and women like Choi and Chui and Siu Wong didn't think they were making a socialist revolution. They started out, they were simply trying to establish a society with a greater degree of social justice than existed in Cuba before them, to narrow the gap between what they saw as the obscenely rich and the desperately poor of Cuba. And the very first act of that revolution, the act that defined the Cuban Revolution more than anything else, was the land reform that they carried out in May of 1959. in which they didn't simply take the idle land of those who from the great plantations that was not being worked, but they established a land ownership limit of 1,000 acres to begin with, and turned over to the thousands and tens of thousands of working farmers and for their families who were working the rest of the land the title to their land, and made that land inalienable, provided the credit at rates that farmers could afford to pay and to pay back, and made it impossible for farmers to be evicted from the land to which they held title. No bank, no other richer farmer could ever take their land from them. And that was the beginning of the great social revolution in Cuba. And it was the beginning of the confrontation with the U.S. government and the ruling families of the United States. Because in the decades between 1900 and 1960 in Cuba, it was the U.S. ruling class and the U.S. wealthy families that came to own the overwhelming majority of the productive property of Cuba. More than 50% of the land of Cuba was owned by U.S. corporations and families. And if you take the most valuable land, the most productive, the richest land, it was far higher. The railroads, the oil refineries, the electrical company, the telephone company, probably the majority of the sugar refineries in Cuba were all owned by U.S. capital. And as the land reform was carried out that affected their interests, it was the point at which the United States government began what has become the 50-year-long economic, first military and economic, and then economic war and political war against the people of Cuba. And to this day, that remains the source of the hostility, that remains the source of the opposition to the Cuban Revolution and its people. It's the answer, I believe, to the question, one of the questions that was posed already this evening. Well, is what we hear about and read about and are taught about the Cuban Revolution in this country accurate? Is it the truth? And I would say, and I think that this book tells you a great deal about the reality and the truth and how untruthful that version of the Cuban Revolution, of what has happened in Cuba is. It was the land reform that was coupled with a massive literacy campaign in the opening years of the revolution that literally within less than a year's period of time, by the mobilization of more than 100,000 overwhelmingly young people, high school students, college students, but overwhelmingly in their teens, to go to the countryside to live with the peasant families, to go into the working class barrios and living with working class families, to wipe out effectively illiteracy in Cuba, which was overall nationally was more than a third. In the rural areas was well over 50%. For women in the rural areas was close to 100%, and it was simply eliminated in a matter of months by the revolutionary mobilization of the resources and the human, both financial and, more important than anything, the human resources that made that possible and that transformed a whole generation of young people who were massively part of this effort. To see what it was possible for human beings working together to accomplish, to transform the society in which they lived, when the restrictions imposed by private property and by capital were not the thing that stopped them from doing it. Many other measures along these lines, of which the tackling the questions of racial discrimination in Cuba, the exclusion of women in large measure from the workforce at that period of time, and so forth, were vital elements of a real social revolution. And as the U.S. war against the people of Cuba intensified, they simply refused to back down. That's all. They simply said, no, we're not going back to the past. We're not going back to a country in which all economic and social decisions are dominated by U.S. imperialism. We have chosen the path of our revolution. It was the men and women like Choi and Chui and Siu Wong, who didn't set out to change the course of history. They simply said, well, this is what we're fighting for. And as they did that, the first socialist revolution in our hemisphere was born. And you see what simply ordinary human beings are capable of accomplishing. They never dreamed they were going to be generals of a revolutionary armed forces someday, or anything else. They didn't. They never. But as they fought along this course, they became the kind of leaders that they developed into. Well, the interviews and other books of interviews that we have done were to get this story, this real truth about the Cuban Revolution and the depth of the popular support for that revolution, to make it available, to make it so that it's something that we could understand, those of us who did not live that in the most immediate sense. And it was in working on some of those books that I first met Gustavo Chui, and began to learn something about the history of Chinese immigration in Cuba, which I knew very little about either. We got talking about it, and I said, well, why don't we? Let's make this available. This chapter of our history as well. And he said, well, that would be fine, but he said, there's actually 3 of us who are generals of the Revolutionary Armed Forces who are of Chinese ancestry. Why don't you interview all 3 of us at the same time? It will be better. It'll be richer. It'll be more. It'll tell you a great deal more. And of course, he was absolutely correct. One of the things that makes this book so interesting is the fact that you get the stories of 3 different human beings, as Keith was describing, very different human beings. Different personalities from different parts of the country and different social backgrounds. And it's the intertwining of their stories that brings the depth and richness to our history is still being written. As in the process of doing this, Siu Wong, also as part of the interviews, went back to recapitulate some of the history of the Chinese immigration in Cuba, which is a there's no, we won't. It's a whole subject in and of itself. But the important thing to understand, which most of us don't know, and certainly I didn't know before, was the extent of the Chinese immigration to Cuba. Chinese workers, indentured workers, contract workers, who were brought to Cuba as part of to work the sugar plantations in the 1800s, as the supply of slaves from Africa was progressively being cut down on, and they brought in massive numbers, more than close to 200,000 Chinese laborers to work those plantations. But it's important to know that during this period of time, the absolute number of Chinese who came to the United States during those same years and the number that went to Cuba in those years were almost the same. It was about 150,000 between 1850 and 1875. But at that period of history, the population of the United States was 38 million, and the population of Cuba was 1.4 million. So the weight of the Chinese immigration in Cuba and its place in the history of Cuba is registered by that fact, and the importance of the Chinese